Chapter 3. Consciousness dawned slowly the next morning. Julie squirmed and a male voice groaned, tightening his hold on her. Brandon. After last night's confessions, she'd asked him not to leave. He was too much like a ghost or a mirage, and she didn't want to wake up and find it was all a dream. So, he'd slipped off his shoes, lain on the bedspread, and wrapped his arms around her. She hadn't slept so well in years. You okay? He slurred his words, and she guessed he was still half asleep. Looking over her shoulder, she caught his eyes, still closed. She shifted so that she could face him, study the tiny wrinkles starting to appear on his face. She ran her finger across his jawline, a strange fascination with the coarse stubble there. Last night, she couldn't bear to think that any time had passed between them, but today. Go back to sleep. She snuggled into his embrace. He nuzzled his face into the crook of her neck like they'd slept like this 100 times before, wrapped in love and vulnerability as they gave in to utter exhaustion. A faint echo of it might have been hung in the air, but it was tempered with the gratitude she now felt that he was here at all. Gratitude she might not feel if she hadn't allowed herself to experience the range of her volatile emotions last night. She slipped out of his embrace and headed into the kitchen, her thoughts too insistent to let her go back to sleep. Thank goodness it was Saturday. She wouldn't have been able to go to work after the emotional roller coaster from the night before, and she would have hated to say something about not feeling well when all she was dealing with was some personal drama. She opened the refrigerator and pulled out a carton of eggs. She wasn't a gourmet chef, but she could feed herself and guests without being embarrassed. Besides, she couldn't imagine a better time to beat eggs. She'd hate for her pent-up energy to go to waste. You know, if you tell a guy to go back to sleep, you probably shouldn't start making breakfast. Julie chuckled as she plated the food. Pizza eggs. My grandma's recipe. Brandon grabbed the butter dish and jam and took them to the table. Did you ever tell your grandmother that this recipe would have been better named the kitchen sink frittata? The only thing that makes these like pizza is that it's cut in wedges. For my grandmother, that would have been enough of a comparison. Brandon took a bite of the whole grain toast on the table. Or she thought you guys were picky eaters, and she decided to call this food something that you might be willing to try. Julie nudged him with her shoulder. My grandmother loved us. Brandon leaned in close, conspiratorially. So did mine, but she still lied to us from time to time. Julie's tone was bright as she pressed against his shoulder. Stop it. His eyes followed her as she set the skillet back on the stove and then walked back to the table. So, are you okay after last night? That was intense. Emotion thickened her throat again, but she managed a thin smile anyway. Yeah, but the only way out is through, right? Jules, I was wrong. I shouldn't have. She raised a hand, and his voice trailed off at her command. I can't do that right now. For now, we're having breakfast. Two friends who haven't seen each other in years, okay? His jaw tensed, but he nodded. Two friends. Got it. She buttered her toast, and Brandon pushed the jar of strawberry rhubarb jam toward her. The action surprised her, and he cleared his throat. Sorry. I guess I still know your routine. Julie didn't say anything, consumed with the sudden urge to use the apricot jam her other grandmother had given her for Christmas instead of the jam in front of her. The strawberry rhubarb only won because she couldn't stand the taste of apricots. It felt too intimate for him to anticipate her needs so well, not after 15 years of separation and a cavernous secret standing between them. She slathered the toast with the red jam and took a bite, and Brandon turned his attention to the eggs which were bursting with zucchini, onions, mushrooms, cheese, tomatoes, and a few crumbles of bacon for extra crunch and flavor. The silence stretched on for a few minutes before the tension grew too much for Julie to bear. She'd cut Brandon off, and the unfinished sentence hung in the air between them. You shouldn't have what? Brandon's eyes searched hers before he spoke. Julie hoped her eyes conveyed her willingness to listen now. After nearly 2 decades of distance, she didn't want anything else to stand between them. 15 years ago, I shouldn't have shut you out. Not after telling you for years that you were my one and only. He reached across the table for her hand, which she gave him. He offered her a grateful smile. It's been my greatest regret, Jules. She glanced down at their hands before she spoke. Your story explained a few things last night, but I'd be lying if I didn't admit it brought up a few more questions too. He bobbed his head as if he anticipated some of them. Why did it take 15 years to find my way back to you? She ducked her head, embarrassed that it was so easy to read. Among others. He let go of her hand, pressing his napkin to his lips to clear away any of the crumbs from breakfast. She shivered, her hand colder than it had any right to be when he pulled away. I was sick off and on for 6 years. I'd start classes at the community college between chemo treatments and surgeries, and then I'd get a bad test result. I almost called you one Christmas. The doctors tried to hide it, but it seemed like it was my last chance to say goodbye. My parents planned a farewell tour of sorts, and I wanted to share that with you. All the strength leached out of her like a spigot had been turned and drained all the blood from her body. She crumpled the tablecloth under her fingers. Chemo. Surgery. 6 years. Last Christmas. All these words were stringing together her worst nightmares from the last 15 years. Only she couldn't shrug it away as an overactive imagination. It had been his reality. After that much time, I couldn't imagine calling and disrupting your world just to tell you that I would be gone soon. So, my parents and I packed up and headed to the Grand Canyon by ourselves. Her throat thickened with emotion, and her eyes stung with unshed tears. While we were on that trip, I got a call that I was approved for a transplant. We cut the trip short so that I could report to the hospital. He toyed with his fork, though it seemed that neither of them had much of an appetite anymore. That transplant saved my life. My health improved dramatically, and in less than a year, the doctors were confident that I was in remission. I didn't know what to do. I'd spent 6 years with death hanging over my head. The only future I had planned was one where I was married to you. The only thing I had to show for those 6 years was my newfound health and a handful of credits I'd gotten through community college. So, you became an accountant. He set the fork down, finished with the pretense of eating. It seemed like a good idea. I could make a decent living, my parents wouldn't be worried about my safety, and numbers had become my lifeline. Statistics, measurements, analytical data, all of it. A hint of a smile lit up inside Julie, and she shook her head. Only you would make it seem logical for a brush with death to push you toward accounting instead of medicine. You sound like my mother. Amusement and affection shone in his smile as he said it. She stood and retrieved a carafe of orange juice from the refrigerator. I happen to like your mother. He was silent as she poured 2 cups of orange juice and returned the bottle to the fridge. Then, she handed one to him. His fingers brushed hers as she passed the glass to him. His touch sent a thrill of electricity crackling up her spine. She wouldn't have guessed she could still be attracted to the man who had left her abruptly on the eve of adulthood, but her body refused to lie to her. He was her other half, her soulmate, her past and her future all rolled into one. He exhaled, a heavy sound that seemed to hint at his mood. Can I ask you a question? Julie tensed, but she nodded. You deserve it after how I've grilled you. He waved the comment away. Anyone in your same position would have asked those questions, and they probably wouldn't have been so nice about it. Your question? He bit his lip. There's no wrong answer to this. Yes, no, or even I don't know, are all perfectly acceptable answers. He wiped at his brow as if he'd broken into a sweat, though Julie couldn't see more than a hint of moisture on his brow. Okay. Am I wrong to think that there's a chance we could find our way back from this, that someday, those kids who thought they were going to get married might still get their wish? She'd suspected this would be his question, but that didn't keep her heart from galloping away as he asked it. She reached for his hand as she pondered her next words. She studied their hands, a little more scarred and a little older than they'd been the last time they'd pondered their future together. His skin was almost papery, a reminder of the 6 years when he'd been in poor health. If things had been different, she would have held Brandon's hand like this when he'd been in the hospital seeking treatment 10 years ago. Maybe it would have been a difficult way to start their life together, but at least they wouldn't have been alone. Brandon was quiet, his eyes focused on their touching hands as well. When she looked up at him, she caught the anxiety in his eyes, the wish that she would just put him out of his misery and give him something more than silence. I don't know. Her words were quiet, almost too soft to be heard, but the room froze with each syllable. Brandon mustered a smile that didn't reach his eyes. I understand. As his head hung in defeat, Julie's heart nearly burst with everything she wanted to say. How can you understand when I don't? You've known the truth this whole time, and I've only had it for a few hours. I need time. I thought I was over you, but I was wrong. Now, I'm scared, and I don't know if I should trust you again. No matter how attracted I still am to you. No matter how familiar your arms are, and how comforting your cologne is in the middle of the night. We were supposed to build a life together, and I've spent too long to build this one on my own to give it up at a moment's notice. The phrases came in snippets, racing through her heart and her brain in such a fury that it almost made her sick. Still, she stayed silent, her hand still holding his. But I think I'd like to find out. The hope in his eyes as his head snapped up did funny things to her heart, flipping and flopping it like a pancake in the air. Are you sure? She breathed out a laugh as he came in for a hug, and she tangled her fingers through his curls. We have a lot of water under this bridge, Bran, a lot of work before we can be anything more than just a collection of memories. He nodded, his eyes moistening with tears that told her he hadn't thought her forgiveness possible. Anything. Her voice lowered to a whisper as she leaned closer to him. I've waited a lifetime for you, Brandon Carmichael. I don't think I can wait anymore. She pressed her lips to his, pleased when he met her halfway, in a kiss that was as full of hope as it was of nostalgia. He wiped her tears away with his thumb, his eyes filled with wonder as he studied her face. Funny how after all these years, I discover that you're even more wonderful than I could have imagined. She wrapped her arms around his neck, determined never to let him go again.